So machine translation post-editing is dead and BureauWorks killed it, right? What do I mean by that statement? So first, let's define machine translation post-editing. So machine translation post-editing is typically the process where you get a file and you run it through a machine translation engine. Could be something like Google or like Amazon or Facebook or Microsoft or DeepL, some machine translation engine. And you're grabbing that content and you're processing it through a machine translation engine, and then now you're giving it to a translator who now has the job, instead of translating from scratch, they're post-editing. So post machine translation, now they're performing their edits, right? That's the idea of machine translation post-editing. Now, the reason why, first, before why it's dead, first, why I dislike it, right? I dislike it because when you process an entire document around a machine translation engine, as good as the engine may be, it's not necessarily calibrated to how I particularly translate. Much less in like the broader scheme of things where like engines are at most trained for a given kind of content, for a given kind of client, not necessarily for a given kind of translator, right? Very few translators have the luxury of having their own trained engines. It's something that requires time, money, investment, right? It's typically a big endeavor to have that. So my main problem around that is the experience is very monological. So it's like, it's the machine translation that has given me something, and whatever I do, the engine is not going to learn from me. At most, I'm going to save my segments in the translation memory. It's not going to react to what I'm doing. It's not going to suggest things. It's a static thing. And it often is, in my opinion, even more painful than translating from scratch, because instead of the experience being for me to put in my authorship into the document, it becomes one of like me looking for errors and inaccuracies and weirdnesses. And I often have to fix the same thing over and over again. Like, let's say the machine translation feed was too informal. That means I have to make the machine translation feed more formal in every single segment. Or if a certain terminology error was made, I have to globally replace that throughout the entire file. And that's not always that simple. So anyway, I developed a dislike for machine translation post-editing, even though I thought it was better than no editing at all, to be clear, right? I thought it was better than not having machine translation at all, but I was still frustrated around the process. Now, the reason why I say it's dead, it's obviously not dead. People are still using it very widely, but it's dead in the sense that context sensitivity is, in my opinion, a much more powerful approach to machine translation post-editing. The reason why is that context sensitivity takes those frustrations that I had and turns those into actual strengths. So my first frustration around the monological nature, context sensitivity makes it dialogical. So now as a translator, I'm actually interacting with an engine that's actually learning from me and becoming more like me. So if I make a change, let's say at the beginning of the file to make things more informal, it will acquire a tendency to be more informal. If I teach it a certain term, it will follow that term. If I make certain kinds of changes, it will note those kinds of changes that I'm making. So it's reacting and learning to my interactions in runtime, which to me is a much more interesting experience. It's also flagging things for me, which is also very interesting, because another frustration I have around translating is it's a very lonely experience. And if I can work with an engine that's actually communicating with me, talking to me, I personally like it. Well, and I understand that that's a matter of taste, right? Some people really don't want to be communicated with, and that's fine. But I appreciate that dialogue that's taking place between me and the engine and me. So as far as why it's dead, there's something much better already available, right? And it's not just me saying this from a qualitative perspective. From a quantitative perspective, we ran a study in over 40 million words in BureauWorks towards the second semester of 2023, and we were able to show that context sensitivity is 39% more effective than machine translation when compared to in terms of TER score, so translation error rates, or the number of edits required to take the suggestion into published. So it's an incredibly powerful approach. In the end, when you strip it apart of everything at its bare bones, it's still a form of machine translation, but it's much more interactive, it's much more fluid, it's much more intuitive, and that's why I think that whatever people used to call machine translation post editing, in my opinion, is dead.